The air in the fouled anchor was a thick marinade of stale beer, fried onions, and the damp, salty grit that blew in off the piers of Naval Station Norfolk. It was a place that clung to the skin and the memory, a purgatory for sailors waiting for deployment, and a confessional for those just returned. The low-ceilinged room was bathed in the jaundiced glow of faux nautical lights shaped like ship's lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows that made every corner seem conspiratorial. The floor was a sticky mosaic of spilled drinks and tracked-in grime, and the low, constant hum of the bar's coolers was a bass note beneath the cacophony of boasts, laughter, and the sharp crack of billiard balls from the back room. It was a place built of hard-won tradition and casual disrespect, where a man's worth was measured in the volume of his voice and the crispness of his uniform, should he choose to wear one. It was, in short, an ecosystem of predictable hierarchies. At a small, scarred table in the corner, a woman sat alone. She was a study in deliberate anonymity, a null space in the loud, vibrant room. She wore simple gray slacks and a plain black sweater, practical and unadorned. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun that did nothing to soften the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. She might have been 30, or she might have been 40. Her expression was a mask of placid neutrality that gave away nothing. Before her sat a half-empty glass of water and a thick, dog-eared book on ancient Greek philosophy, its pages filled with the dense, unforgiving text of Thucydides. She did not seem to be reading it so much as communing with it, her focus an invisible wall that partitioned her from the surrounding chaos. She was so still, so utterly self-contained, that she almost ceased to exist, fading into the background like a piece of forgotten furniture. This was her camouflage, and it was as effective as any mottled green and brown fatigues. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and in the circles that mattered, she was known only by a single word: echo. Holding court in the center of the room like a belligerent lighthouse was Lieutenant Derek Vance. His men called him Diesel behind his back, a moniker earned less for his power and more for the loud, noxious fumes of his personality. He was a man built of broad shoulders and a square jaw, his face looking like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, if the sculptor had been in a hurry and used a dull chisel. He was a surface warfare officer, a SWO, a master of a ship's deck and a tyrant in its wardroom. His confidence was a physical presence, radiating from him like heat from a furnace, warming those who agreed with him and scorching those who did not. Tonight, he was in his element, surrounded by a coterie of young ensigns and junior lieutenants who hung on his every word, their laughter a little too loud, their nods a little too eager. He was telling a story, his voice a booming baritone that easily conquered the bar's ambient noise, his hands gesturing wildly, sloshing amber beer from the heavy glass mug he wielded like a scepter. The ecosystem of the fouled anchor operated on simple, observable laws. Men like Lieutenant Vance were the apex predators, their authority unquestioned within these four walls. Women like Evelyn Reed were, in this context, invisible. They were assumed to be civilians, wives, girlfriends, or at best, administrative personnel from the base. Part of the scenery, but not part of the action. This fundamental, unexamined assumption was the bedrock upon which the evening's catastrophe would be built. The onlookers, the chorus of sailors and officers scattered throughout the bar, were content to observe these laws. They were the silent majority, complicit in their inaction, upholding the established order simply by refusing to question it. They saw the loud, confident lieutenant in the quiet, unassuming woman, and their minds filled in the rest of the story with the ink of prejudice and experience. The catalyst for the night's unraveling was not a person of rank or status, but one of the most invisible figures in the entire naval hierarchy: a janitor. His name was Mr. Alastair Finch, a man of 67 who had been swabbing the decks of naval installations for 40 years, a civilian contractor whose quiet, diligent work was the only thing standing between order and entropy. He moved through the bar with the slow, shuffling gait of a man whose joints had paid the price for a lifetime of hard labor, his gray uniform faded, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He was pushing a large, yellow bucket on wheels, the water within it sloshing rhythmically, a murky gray tide. As he passed Lieutenant Vance's table, one of the ensigns, laughing at his superior's joke, threw his arm back and clipped the bucket. The impact was not dramatic, but it was decisive. The bucket tipped, and a wave of dirty water surged across the floor, washing over the polished black boots of Lieutenant Vance. For a moment, there was silence. The joke died on Vance's lips. He looked down at his sullied boots, his face slowly twisting from jovial arrogance into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Mr. Finch froze, his old eyes wide with alarm. "Sir, I am so sorry, so terribly sorry," he stammered, his hands fluttering uselessly as he reached for a rag on his cart. Vance's voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was worse. It was a low, menacing growl, filled with the condescending poison of a man who believed his station gave him dominion over all lesser beings. "Sorry? You think sorry is going to clean this filth off my boots, old man?" He kicked his foot out, spattering more water. "Look at this. Do you have any idea how much these boots cost? Of course you don't. It's probably more than you make in a week of sloshing your grime all over the place." The ensigns around him snickered, their loyalty to their superior overriding any flicker of decency. Mr. Finch visibly shrank, his shoulders slumping as the verbal blows landed. "It was an accident, sir. I'll clean it right up. I'll polish your boots myself." "You'll stay away from my boots," Vance sneered, enjoying the performance, the public demonstration of his power. "You've done enough damage. Now get your trash and get out of my sight before I report you to your supervisor. Maybe it's time you retired and made way for someone who can still walk a straight line." The cruelty was naked, designed to humiliate, to break the old man down in front of an audience. It was a petty display of power, a dog barking to prove it owned the yard. And it was in that moment of distilled injustice that the quiet woman in the corner finally moved. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed her book, placing a single finger to mark her page, and spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense silence of the bar with the clarity of a ship's bell in a dense fog. "He said it was an accident, Lieutenant." Every head in the bar turned. The statement was so simple, so factual, delivered in a tone of calm, level observation, that it seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with an authority it had no right to possess. Lieutenant Vance slowly turned his head, his eyes narrowing as he finally, truly registered the woman in the corner. He saw what everyone else saw, a plain, unremarkable civilian who had inexplicably decided to insert herself into military business. His lips curled into a contemptuous smirk. This was a new target, and a more interesting one. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness as he sauntered over to her table. "Did you say something? I must have misheard. I thought I heard a civilian offering an opinion on a matter that doesn't concern her." He leaned over her table, planting his large hands on its surface, invading her space. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to make her feel small and overwhelmed. Evelyn Reed did not lean back. She did not flinch. She simply looked up at him, her gaze as steady and dispassionate as a surgeon's. "I said," she repeated, her tone unchanged, "that the man apologized for an accident. Your response seems disproportionate." The clinical precision of the word disproportionate seemed to infuriate Vance more than any insult could have. It was an academic word, a word of analysis, not of emotion. She was not fighting him. She was diagnosing him. "Disproportionate," he barked, a harsh laugh escaping his lips. The ensigns behind him joined in, a loyal chorus of hyenas. "Lady, you have no idea what world you've just stepped into. This is a naval establishment. We have standards. We have discipline, things you clearly wouldn't understand. Now, I suggest you go back to your book club reading and let the men handle this." He punctuated his statement by flicking a dismissive finger at her copy of Thucydides, as if it were a romance novel. The book slid a few inches across the table. Her eyes followed the movement, then returned to his face. There was no anger in them. There was no fear. There was only a profound, unnerving calm, the calm of a deep ocean trench, oblivious to the storm raging on the surface. It was the response of a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, watching with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. "My understanding of this establishment is adequate," she said, her voice still impossibly level. Her refusal to be baited, to show fear or anger, was a foreign concept to Vance. His entire worldview was built on a foundation of emotional leverage and dominance displays. When they failed, he had no other tools. His frustration began to curdle into genuine rage. He saw her calm not as strength, but as mockery. "Is that so?" he snarled, his face now inches from hers. The smell of beer on his breath was a fetid wave. "Well, let me educate you. In my Navy, we don't coddle incompetence. We don't make excuses for screw-ups. That old man is a liability, and you, for some reason, think it's your place to defend him. Who are you, his daughter, his lawyer?" She did not answer the question. She simply held his gaze. Her silence was more powerful than any retort. It was a void that he felt compelled to fill with more and more of his own bluster. The bar was now completely silent, every patron a spectator to the unfolding drama. They were watching a train wreck in slow motion, and no one dared to intervene. The law of the ecosystem was in full effect. The predator had cornered its prey, and the herd could only watch. "Nothing to say?" Vance taunted, his voice rising in volume. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing you've bitten off more than you can chew?" He straightened up, a triumphant look on his face as he addressed the room. "See? This is what happens when civilians try to play in our sandbox. They don't get it." He turned back to her, his final act of dominance prepared. He reached down, grabbed her glass of water, and with a deliberate, theatrical motion, upended it onto her open book. Water soaked the ancient text, warping the pages, blurring the ink. It was a petty, needlessly destructive act, the final tantrum of a man whose authority had been quietly questioned and found wanting. He expected a guapam, tears, a shout of outrage. He expected a reaction. He got none. Evelyn Reed looked at the ruined book on the table. Then she looked at her hands, which were resting in her lap. She slowly, deliberately lifted them and placed them flat on the table, palms down on either side of the sodden manuscript. She did not look at Vance. She did not look at anyone. She just stared at the table, her posture unchanged. She did not flinch. She did not turn. Her stillness, which had been a quiet statement, now became a terrifying weapon. It was unnatural. It was the calm at the absolute center of a hurricane, a place where the laws of nature seemed to be suspended. Vance felt a flicker of unease, a cold prickle on the back of his neck. Her lack of response was a mirror, and in it, he saw his own behavior reflected back at him, stripped of its justification, and it looked ugly and small. Before he could formulate another insult, another way to provoke the reaction he so desperately needed, the world outside the fouled anchor ended. It began not with a bang, but with a scream, a high-pitched metallic shriek that tore through the night, a sound of tortured steel that vibrated through the soles of their feet. It was followed by a deep, groaning roar, like a leviathan waking from a 1,000-year slumber. The lights in the bar flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. A collective shout of alarm rose from the patrons. Seconds later, the emergency lights kicked in, casting the room in a hellish, pulsating red glow. Through the salt-stained windows, they could see the world outside had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and water. Then the klaxon started. The piercing, rhythmic shriek of the base-wide emergency alarm, a sound that every sailor is trained to recognize and fear. It was the signal for a catastrophic failure, an imminent danger to the station. Panic, a wild and contagious animal, was uncaged in the bar. Men who had faced enemy fire were now just a confused, shouting mob. Chairs were knocked over. Glasses shattered. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the bar dissolved in an instant. Lieutenant Vance was caught in the same tide of confusion as everyone else. He spun around, his face pale in the red light, trying to process the sensory overload. His training kicked in, but it was a clumsy, blunt instrument in the face of such chaos. "Everyone stay calm," he bellowed, but his voice was tight with his own fear, and it was swallowed by the rising panic and the howl of the wind outside. "Form an orderly line to the shelter. Ensigns, get a head count." His orders were straight from the manual, textbook responses to a generic emergency. They were also completely useless. The problem was not inside the bar, it was outside. And it was far worse than he could imagine. A young sailor, his face white with terror, burst through the doors, a torrent of wind and rain following him in. "The moorings!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Pier 4, the USS Vicksburg. Her forward line snapped in the squall. She's swinging into the Ticonderoga." The blood drained from Vance's face. The Vicksburg was a guided missile cruiser, a multi-billion-dollar asset. The Ticonderoga was another. A collision between two warships of that size, especially in a storm, would be an unprecedented disaster. It could rupture fuel tanks, damage weapon systems, and potentially trigger a chain reaction of destruction along the entire pier, which was also home to a nuclear submarine. His mind raced, cycling through emergency protocols, but they were all designed for fires, for flooding, for situations with clear, established procedures. This was a freak event, a perfect storm of mechanical failure and violent weather. He was a SWO, but his expertise was in sailing a ship, not in stopping one from tearing itself apart against a pier. He was frozen, his authority revealed as a hollow shell, his booming voice silenced by the sheer scale of the crisis. He was just another frightened man in a room full of them. And in that moment of collective paralysis, the quiet woman moved. Evelyn Reed rose from her chair in a single fluid motion. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. Her previous stillness coalesced into a terrifying economy of action. It was as if a statue had come to life, not with the jerky movements of a golem, but with the sublime, lethal grace of a predator. The shift was so absolute, so profound, that it created its own pocket of silence around her. As she walked toward the door, the panicked crowd seemed to part for her instinctively, a subconscious recognition of a purpose far greater than their own fear. She reached the terrified sailor at the door and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same calm, level tone she had used with Vance, but now it was imbued with an undeniable, resonant power. It was the voice of command. "What's the wind speed and direction?" The sailor, startled, stammered, Gusting to 90 knots, sir. Ma'am, coming in from 220. "Tide?" she asked, her eyes already scanning the chaos outside. "Coming in. High tide in 40 minutes. "Understood." She turned from the sailor and her eyes swept the room, not seeing a mob, but seeing resources. She pointed a finger, not at an officer, but at a burly chief petty officer with a bosun's insignia tattooed on his forearm. "Chief, I need every man you can find who has served on a salvage or tug crew, now." The chief, a man who would normally only take orders from a commissioned officer he knew, found himself saying, "Aye, ma'am," before he even had time to think. There was something in her gaze, a weight of experience and authority that transcended rank or uniform. She then pointed at another sailor, a young communications tech. "You, get on the horn to port operations. I don't care who you have to override. I need a full engineering schematic of the mooring bollards on Pier 4, specifically their sheer strength and anchor points. And I need a live feed from every camera with a view of the Vicksburg's bow. Tell them it's a Sea Dragon priority directive. Use those exact words." The sailor blinked, confused by the strange designation. But the certainty in her voice propelled him into action. Lieutenant Vance watched, dumbfounded. This was his scene to command, his crisis to manage. But this woman, this civilian, was issuing complex, highly specific orders with the calm assurance of an admiral. She spoke a foreign language of expertise, a dialect of wind speeds, tidal flows, and engineering tolerances that he barely understood. She was not shouting. She was not panicking. She was operating. In less than 30 seconds, she had transformed the chaotic bar into a makeshift command center. She moved out into the storm, the wind tearing at her, plastering her simple clothes to her frame. She seemed oblivious to the horizontal rain and the deafening roar. Her eyes were fixed on the pier, where the massive gray silhouette of the Vicksburg was groaning and swinging wildly on its remaining stern lines, its bow sweeping back and forth like the head of a mortally wounded beast. Every time it swung, its flared anchor housing came terrifyingly close to the delicate superstructure of the adjacent cruiser. Men began to rally to her, drawn by the irresistible gravity of her competence. The bosun's mate returned with a half-dozen grizzled sailors, men with hands like leather and eyes that had seen everything the sea could throw at them. She did not give them a speech. She gave them a problem and a solution. "The stern lines won't hold for long against this torsion," she said, her voice impossibly clear over the gale. "We can't pull her back. We need to control her swing. I need 3 emergency hawsers, not nylon, aramid fiber, 3-strand. Get them from the salvage locker. We're going to attach them to the forward chocks and run them to the pier's main cargo cranes. We're not going to pull. We're going to use the cranes as static anchor points to dampen the oscillation. It's a momentum trap." Vance, who had followed her out onto the pier, could only stare. A momentum trap. It was not a standard procedure. It was a concept from advanced physics applied to naval salvage in real time. It was brilliant. It was also incredibly dangerous. If they miscalculated the load, the lines would snap like threads, whipping back with enough force to cut a man in half. "Ma'am," the chief said, his face grim, "the cargo cranes are powered down for the storm. It would take 20 minutes to get them operational." "We don't have 20 minutes," she replied without missing a beat. "We don't need the motors. We just need the structure. Get a team with cutting torches. We're going to sever the crane hooks and weld the hawser shackles directly to the crane booms. It's a one-time solution. Do it." It was an order to deliberately damage millions of dollars of port equipment to save billions in naval assets. It was a decision a captain would hesitate to make, a decision that would require an admiral's approval. She made it in a heartbeat, as if she were ordering lunch. The sailors, recognizing the brutal logic of the command, scrambled to obey. For the next 15 minutes, the woman in the black sweater orchestrated a symphony of controlled chaos. She stood on the exposed pier, a small, unmoving figure in the heart of the storm, directing the complex, dangerous ballet around her. She was a master conductor, and her orchestra was composed of steel, rope, and the courage of the sailors she commanded. She sent a team of divers — where had she found divers? — into the churning water to assess the integrity of the pier's underwater pilings. She had another team setting up collision mats, a desperate last-ditch effort. She seemed to be everywhere at once, her calm voice cutting through the wind, anticipating every problem, solving every crisis before it could fully form. Lieutenant Vance stood uselessly to the side, soaked to the bone, a spectator at his own abdication. The woman he had mocked, the civilian he had tried to humiliate, was now commanding a major damage control operation with a level of skill and audacity he had never witnessed in his entire career. His world had been turned upside down. The foundations of his reality — rank, uniform, gender, volume — had all crumbled, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own inadequacy. He watched her, and a dawning, terrifying comprehension began to bloom in his mind. She was no civilian. She was something else entirely. The screech of tires cut through the storm's roar. A pair of Humvees, lights flashing, careened onto the pier and skidded to a halt. The doors flew open and a group of men in full combat gear jumped out, followed by a towering, imposing figure whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. He wore the uniform of a Master Chief Petty Officer, and his chest was a solid block of ribbons. His face was a craggy landscape of authority, etched with the lines of 100 deployments and 1,000 hard decisions. This was Master Chief Elias Thorne, the senior enlisted man for the entire naval base, a living legend whose word carried more weight than that of most admirals. Master Chief Thorne took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. The howling storm, the groaning ship, the sailors working with desperate, focused energy. Then his eyes landed on the woman in the center of it all. His entire demeanor changed. The hard lines of his face softened, not with weakness, but with something that looked like profound, immediate respect. All the urgency and alarm vanished, replaced by the calm of a man who has just found the one person who can solve an impossible problem. He strode forward, his boots splashing through the deep puddles, ignoring everyone else. He ignored the frantic base security. He ignored the panicked port operations crew. He walked right past Lieutenant Vance as if he were a ghost. He stopped 5 feet from the woman, the storm raging around them as if they stood in a private bubble of calm. Then, in a voice that was a force of nature in its own right, a gravelly boom that needed no amplification to be heard over the gale, he bellowed a command that shattered what was left of Derek Vance's world. "Attention on deck!" The effect was electric. Every sailor on the pier, from the lowest seaman to the highest-ranking officer present, instinctively snapped to the position of attention. Their training was a reflex deeper than thought, deeper than fear. They stood ramrod straight, their eyes locked forward amidst the chaos of the storm. Master Chief Thorne himself executed the sharpest, most respectful salute Vance had ever seen. It was not the perfunctory gesture offered to a junior officer. It was the salute reserved for flag officers, for heroes, for royalty. "Commander Reed," the Master Chief said, his voice resonating with a deep, unshakable deference. "We didn't know you were stateside. The Admiral sends his compliments and asks what you require." Commander, the word detonated in the air. Lieutenant Vance felt a shockwave in his bones. Commander? Not a civilian, not a dependent. A commander. An Ofamam. Two full ranks above him. But it was more than the rank. It was the way the Master Chief had said it. It was the look in his eyes. It was the name that followed. Reed. And then the second name. The one the communications tech had been told to use. The priority directive. Sea Dragon. The narrator's voice would later fill in the gaps for those who did not know, explaining how the name Evelyn Reed was, in the highest echelons of the United States Navy, a legend spoken in hushed, reverent tones. Commander Evelyn Echo Reed, one of the first women to ever pass the brutal selection process for the Navy SEALs. Not just pass, but graduate at the top of her class. Her file was a thick volume of blacked-out ink and unbelievable commendations. 2 Navy Crosses, 4 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star with Valor. She had planned and led operations that the public would never know about, missions that had altered the course of geopolitics from the shadows. She was a strategic genius with a PhD in applied physics, the Navy's ultimate problem solver, their ghost, their sea dragon. She was the person they sent in when the situation was impossible, when the rulebook had been thrown out, when all other options had failed. She was not just an officer. She was an event. Commander Reed turned to the Master Chief, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. She did not return the salute. In a crisis, such formalities were secondary to the mission. "Master Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the wind, "the Admiral can send me a full damage control team from the submarine base. I need welders and hydraulic specialists, and get me a direct line to the Fleet Weather Center. I want real-time satellite imagery of this squall line. I think it's moving faster than they predicted." "Eat, Commander," Thorne replied, already turning to relay the orders. He paused and looked back at her. "It's good to have you back, ma'am." "It's good to be back, Master Chief," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. She then turned, her eyes sweeping over the assembled men, and they fell upon the pale, trembling form of Lieutenant Derek Vance. He stood frozen, a statue of his own obsolescence, the red emergency lights reflecting in his wide, horrified eyes. The crisis was averted. Under Commander Reed's direction, the hawsers were secured, the massive cruiser's wild swing was tamed, and the ship was held fast against the storm until tugboats could safely nudge it back into its berth. The storm blew itself out by dawn, leaving behind a gray, exhausted peace. The pier was a mess of discarded equipment and frayed nerves, but the warships, all multi-billion-dollar assets, were safe. In the cold, antiseptic light of the morning, in the base commander's office, the final act of the drama played out. Commander Reed stood beside the Admiral's desk, sipping a cup of black coffee, looking as calm and composed as if she had just spent the night reading in a library. She was now in a dry, crisp naval uniform, the silver oak leaf of a commander on her collar stark and undeniable. Across the room, standing at a rigid, terrified brace, was Lieutenant Vance. Master Chief Thorne stood by the door, his expression unreadable stone. Commander Reed took a slow sip of her coffee, then set the mug down with a quiet click. She looked at Vance, and her eyes were not angry or triumphant. They were the eyes of an instructor about to dissect a failed training exercise. "Lieutenant Vance," she began, her voice quiet but filling the room. "Last night you were faced with 2 unforeseen events. The first was a minor incident involving a civilian contractor. The second was a major crisis involving a potential catastrophic loss of naval assets. In both instances, you failed. I am not interested in your humiliation. I am interested in the operational lesson. So tell me, Lieutenant, what was your primary tactical error?" Vance swallowed hard, his throat dry. Ma'am, I underestimated the severity of the storm. Incorrect, she said, her voice sharp as chipped ice. The storm was a condition, not an error. Your error occurred long before the first line snapped. It occurred in the bar. She took a step toward him. Your primary tactical error was a failure of intelligence. You made an assessment based on incomplete and biased data. You saw a woman in civilian clothes and you logged her in your mind as non-threat, non-asset, irrelevant. You saw an elderly janitor and logged him as expendable. You allowed your personal arrogance and your prejudices to build your reality, a reality in which you were the most important person in the room. She paused, letting the words sink in. That flawed reality rendered you deaf, dumb, and blind. You failed to see a potential ally in Mr. Finch's decades of experience on these piers. You failed to identify a senior special warfare officer sitting 3 feet away from you. Your ego created a fatal blind spot that, in a combat situation, would not have resulted in embarrassment, but in death. The deaths of your sailors and the failure of your mission. She walked around him, circling him as a shark circles its prey, but her purpose was not to kill, but to teach. Your treatment of Mr. Finch was not a simple act of cruelty, Lieutenant. It was a symptom of your operational disease. You believe strength is loud. You believe authority is demonstrated through domination. You are wrong. True strength is the quiet competence that gets the job done. True authority is not taken. It is granted by those who recognize your ability to lead them through the fire. Last night you had the rank, but you had no authority. The sailors on that pier did not follow you. They followed the plan that made sense. They followed the voice that was calm. They followed competence. She stopped in front of him again. The Uniform Code of Military Justice has a dozen articles I could charge you with. Conduct unbecoming an officer, dereliction of duty, publicly disrespecting a superior commissioned officer. The admiral would be happy to oblige me. A court-martial would end your career. But I find that to be an inefficient solution. Your career is not the asset I am interested in salvaging. Your perspective is. She turned to the admiral, who had been watching the entire exchange in silence. Admiral, with your permission, I am requisitioning Lieutenant Vance. He is being reassigned, effective immediately, to my personal staff for a 6-month period of special instruction. He will be my executive assistant. He will carry my gear. He will fetch my coffee. And he will stand behind me and watch, silently, as we solve problems he does not yet have the framework to comprehend. His punishment will not be a demotion. His punishment will be an education. The admiral nodded slowly. He's yours, Commander. Lieutenant Vance could only stare, his mind reeling. It was a fate worse and more profound than a court-martial. He was not being discarded. He was being remade, forged in the crucible of a competence so far beyond his own that it might as well have been magic. He would be forced to spend every day in the shadow of the woman he had belittled, forced to confront his own monumental ignorance until it was burned away. The story of that night passed into the lore of Naval Station Norfolk. It became a fable, a teaching tool told to new ensigns in the wardrooms and to new recruits in the barracks. The details shifted with each telling, as all good sea stories do, but the core truth remained. It was the story of the quiet commander who tamed a storm, the story of the loud lieutenant who was silenced by a glass of water, and a lesson in humility. It was a reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you don't see, and that true power has no need to raise its voice. Years passed. On a polished stage at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, a guest lecturer stood before a hall of bright-eyed midshipmen. He was a commander now, his uniform immaculate, his bearing quiet and confident. His name was Derek Vance. He was known as one of the most thoughtful and effective instructors at the Academy, a man who taught not just strategy, but wisdom. Your greatest enemy, he told the rapt audience, will not be a foreign power or a new piece of technology. Your greatest enemy will be your own assumptions. It will be the lazy, comfortable prejudice that allows you to categorize the world into threats and non-threats based on what you see, rather than what you know. He paused and his eyes had a faraway look. I once made that mistake. I stood on the deck of my own arrogance and believed I was the captain of the world. I saw a quiet woman reading a book and I saw nothing. I saw an old man with a mop and I saw a target. I was wrong. The woman was Commander Evelyn Reed, a living legend. The book was Thucydides. And the lesson she taught me was that the tide of battle and of life is turned not by the loudest voice, but by the calmest mind. She taught me that respect is the currency of leadership. You do not demand it, you earn it with every quiet, competent action. Your uniform gives you rank. Your actions give you honor. He looked out at the faces of the Navy's future, and he gave them the gift that Commander Reed had given him, the painful, liberating truth. Look for the quiet ones. Listen to the ones who do not speak often. Seek out the competence that does not need to advertise. Your assumptions can make you a fool in a bar, or they can get your entire crew killed in the South China Sea. The choice is yours. Never ever judge a person's strength by the volume of their voice. Judge them by the stillness of their hands in a storm. And somewhere on a distant black-tide shore or in a quiet, sterile briefing room deep in the Pentagon, a woman with calm eyes and an unassuming sweater continued her work. She was Echo, the sea dragon, a quiet professional whose actions spoke with the force of a tidal wave, forever shaping a world that would never even know her name. Her legacy was not in the medals she never wore, but in the transformed lives of those she taught, and in the quiet, powerful truth that substance will always, in the end, triumph over style, and that the greatest strength is the one that has nothing to prove. It simply is, and that is enough.